Some vacation rentals have house rules for a reason. But what happens when the rules aren't about protecting the property? They're about protecting you from the person you came with. My name is Sam Peterson, and I'm writing this, handshaking, from a hotel room in Knoxville because I haven't been able to bring myself to go back to our apartment in Cincinnati. Not since the Airbnb cabin, not since I realized I never really knew the person I was sleeping next to for 2 years. And I keep asking myself if I should have seen it coming, if there were signs I missed or questions I should have asked, but didn't because I was too comfortable, too sure that the life we'd built together was exactly what it looked like on the surface. Jenna and I had been together since our mutual friend Derek set us up at a bar downtown, and for the first 18 months, everything felt easy. We fell into a routine of grocery runs and Netflix binges and lazy Sundays where neither of us wanted to leave the couch. And I thought that was what love was supposed to look like. This comfortable groove you carved into each other's lives until you couldn't remember what it felt like to be alone. And I thanked God every morning for bringing her into my life because I genuinely believed I'd found the person I was going to spend the rest of my days with. And I never once questioned it, because why would I? She was kind and smart and funny, and she laughed at my terrible jokes even when they weren't funny. And that's the kind of thing you don't let go of. But lately, she'd been different. Quieter at dinner, distracted when I talked about work. And 3 weeks ago, she'd come to me with a proposition. A long weekend at a remote cabin in the Blue Ridge Mountains. Just the two of us. No phones, no interruptions. A chance to remember why we'd started dating in the first place. And I said yes immediately, because I wanted to believe that's all it was. A couple trying to reconnect after a rough few months. And I didn't ask why she'd already found the listing, why she'd already researched the area, why she seemed so certain about a trip she was presenting, like it was my idea. I think part of me knew on some level that something was off, but I told myself I was being paranoid, that couples just got comfortable sometimes, that a little trip to the mountains was exactly what we needed to get back on track. The cabin was called Whitmore Ridge, a restored A-frame with a stone fireplace and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a valley that stretched for miles, and the listing was surprisingly detailed. There were 14 photos, a full description of the surrounding trails, a note about the nearest town being 40 minutes away by car. But what caught my eye was the nightly rate, which was higher than I'd expected for a rural rental in the off-season. And when I mentioned it to Jenna, she waved the concern away and said the price was worth it. She'd checked the reviews. Everyone said it was immaculate. And I wanted to ask her why she was so invested in this particular place. But something in her expression stopped me. This strange certainty that I hadn't seen before, like she'd already made up her mind about everything and was just waiting for me to catch up. And I remember praying that night before bed that this trip would be good for us, that we'd come back stronger, that whatever was bothering her would fade once we got away from the city and all its distractions. We booked it that night, and the confirmation email arrived with an attachment, a PDF titled Guest Guidelines, Whitmore Ridge. And Jenna opened it before I could even sit down, scanning through it with a focus that felt oddly intense for a list of housekeeping instructions. And when I asked what was in it, she just said, standard stuff. Trash pickup and thermostat settings and checkout time. Nothing unusual, nothing that needed my attention. But something about the way she said it made me wonder what she wasn't telling me, what she already knew, that I was about to find out the hard way, and I think that's when the doubt really started to take root. Not as a single moment, but as a slow, creeping feeling that something in our story wasn't adding up the way it should. We drove up the mountain on a Friday afternoon in late October, the trees on either side of the road turning shades of orange and red that looked artificially bright, like someone had turned the saturation up on the real world. And the last 20 minutes of the drive was nothing but gravel and dirt. No cell service, no other houses, nothing but pines and silence, and the slow realization that we'd left everything familiar behind. That whatever happened in that cabin would happen far away from anyone who could help us. And I remember squeezing Jenna's hand as we bounced over a particularly rough patch of road and telling myself that the creepy vibe was just the mountains doing their thing, that every rural area felt like this when you got far enough from civilization, that I was being dramatic and needed to relax and enjoy the weekend like I'd promised myself I would. Jenna directed me up the final stretch with a confidence that should have been ordinary, but felt off somehow, like she'd driven this road before, even though she swore she hadn't. And when we finally pulled up to the cabin, it was smaller than the photos had suggested, darker. The wood on the exterior weathered in a way the listing hadn't shown, and Jenna got out of the car and stood there looking at it with an expression I couldn't read. Relief, maybe, or dread, or something in between that didn't have a name. And she didn't move for a long time. She just stood there with her keys in her hand and her eyes on the front door like she was waiting for something. And when I asked if she was okay, she said she was just taking it in, that it was beautiful. But her voice didn't match her words, and I wondered what she was really looking at, what she was really seeing that I couldn't. The rulebook had mentioned a locked basement, a no visitors policy, a specific checkout time of 10 a.m. sharp, and I figured those were just eccentricities of a private owner trying to protect a historic property from careless guests. But when we went inside and I saw the basement door for myself, heavy wood, industrial padlock on the outside, the kind of lock you use when you're keeping something in rather than keeping people out, I felt the first real twinge of unease. And I asked Jenna if she knew why a vacation rental would need a lock like that, and she said quietly that some basements just weren't safe. Old houses, structural issues. That's probably all it was, but she didn't look at me when she said it, and her voice had this strange flatness to it that made me wonder what else she wasn't telling me. And I think I prayed right there, silently, asking God to help me let it go, to not make a big deal out of nothing, to just trust that she knew what she was talking about, even though something in my gut was screaming that she didn't. That first night we built a fire and opened a bottle of wine, and I tried to push the basement out of my mind, and for a few hours it worked. We laughed about Derek's terrible dating advice. We planned hikes for the morning. We fell into the easy rhythm I'd always loved about being with her. And I thought maybe the weirdness of the day was just first day jitters, the exhaustion of travel and unfamiliarity. But around 11 p.m., I woke up in the dark to find the bedroom door open, which was strange because I could have sworn I'd closed it before bed. And when I got up to check, I found Jenna standing at the end of the hallway in front of the basement door, just standing there in the dark, not touching it, not doing anything, just staring at it like she was waiting for something. And when I said her name, she turned around smoothly and smiled and said she was just getting water. And I watched her walk back to bed, and I lay there in the dark for a long time, wondering why she'd been standing in front of a locked door at midnight, and whether the rules had said anything about that, and whether she'd read them as carefully as I was starting to think she had. The next morning I woke up before her, which never happens, and I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table trying to figure out what was bothering me about this place. And I realized it wasn't any one thing. It was the accumulation of small wrongnesses, the way Jenna knew exactly which burner on the stove worked best without testing them, the way she set her alarm for 6 a.m. without mentioning it, and then was already awake when it went off. The way she'd mentioned the trail behind the cabin had a creek crossing at the halfway point before we'd even looked at the trail map. And I sat there with my coffee getting colder by the minute, and I prayed that God would show me what was really going on, because I was starting to feel like I was losing my mind, like I was seeing patterns that weren't there, like maybe I was the one with the problem and not her. I mentioned the trail thing to her over breakfast, trying to keep my tone light, and she laughed and said maybe she'd just done a good job researching. And I said, yeah, maybe. But there was something in the way she said it that made me feel like she was performing confidence rather than actually feeling it. Like she'd practiced this conversation in her head before I brought it up. And I didn't push because I didn't want to start a fight on day 2 of our trip. Because I still wanted to believe that this was just a rough patch and not something deeper, something wrong with the foundation of everything I thought I knew about her. By mid-afternoon, I decided to stop pushing. We were here to reconnect. I'd said that to myself a dozen times, and maybe the weirdness was just the strangeness of being in a new place. Maybe I was reading too much into a locked door and a few coincidences. Maybe I just needed to relax and trust her like a good boyfriend was supposed to. But then I found the notebook. It was in the junk drawer by the refrigerator, tucked between a roll of tape and a package of batteries. And I only noticed it because a corner of it was sticking out. And when I pulled it out, I saw that it was a small leather journal, the kind you'd buy at a gift shop. And on the first page there was a date from 3 years ago and the initials JM, written in handwriting that wasn't Jenna's. It was messier, more angular, and I opened it to a random page and read a sentence that made my stomach drop. She doesn't know yet, but I'm going to tell her tonight. I'm going to tell her everything, and if she can't accept it, then I'll have to make her understand. And I felt my hands go cold as I read those words again and again, trying to understand what they meant, who JM was, and why someone had written about telling someone something that they couldn't accept. I closed the notebook immediately and put it back exactly where I'd found it. And when Jenna came into the kitchen a few minutes later, I was pouring myself a second cup of coffee like nothing had happened. And she looked at me and asked if I was okay. And I said, yeah, just tired. And she smiled and said she was glad we came here. And I said, me too. And neither of us mentioned the notebook. And I realized with a slow, cold certainty that she knew I'd found it. She had to have known. Because she'd been the one who'd led me to the junk drawer in the first place. She'd mentioned needing tape for a package. And that's what made me open that drawer. And I wondered if this was a test, if she was watching to see what I'd do, if she'd planned for me to find it and was just waiting to see how I'd react. And I didn't sleep much that night because every time I closed my eyes, I saw those words. I'll have to make her understand. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay there listening to the cabin settle around us, the wood creaking in ways that sounded almost deliberate, like Morse code from inside the walls. And I thought about the notebook and the initials and the words that had been waiting in that drawer for 3 years. And I wondered if JM was the same person who'd written the rules. And I prayed silently under my breath that God would protect us both that night, because something felt wrong in a way I couldn't name. Like the cabin itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. And around 2 a.m., I heard it. A sound from below, from the basement. A rhythmic tapping that went on for exactly 30 seconds before stopping abruptly. And I sat up in bed and listened and heard nothing. Just the silence of a house that was supposed to be empty except for us. And I told myself it was just the wind. Just old wood settling the way old wood does in mountain cabins at night. When I looked at Jenna, she was awake, watching me from the pillow beside me. And she said very quietly that I should go back to sleep, that old cabins made noises. And I asked her how she knew it was the basement making the sound, if she'd never been here before. And she didn't answer right away. She just lay there in the dark, looking at me with an expression I couldn't read. And then she said that the rules existed because of what had happened here. And I asked her what had happened, and she said it wasn't her story to tell. Not yet, but soon. And when I pressed her, she turned away from me and said that some things you had to experience for yourself or they wouldn't make sense. And I wanted to argue, but something in her voice stopped me. This weariness that sounded like it came from years ago. Like she'd had this conversation before and was tired of trying to explain. And I lay back down and stared at the ceiling and didn't sleep again until the sun came up. The next morning she was different. Not cold, not warm, just absent in a way I hadn't noticed before. Like part of her was already somewhere else, like she was going through the motions of being Jenna, but the real Jenna had stepped back and left something else in her place. And when I asked if she wanted to do the big hike we'd planned, she said she had something to tell me first. And the way she said it made my stomach drop. Because it wasn't the tone of someone about to confess an affair or admit they'd made a mistake. It was the tone of someone about to tell you something they'd been rehearsing for a very long time, something they needed you to hear before you could move forward. And I sat down at the kitchen table across from her, and she folded her hands and looked at me and said that she'd lied, that she hadn't found this cabin by accident, that she'd been here before with someone else, a man she'd dated for a few months before me, and that the rules in the PDF weren't general housekeeping guidelines. They were specific instructions written for that man after something happened between them, and she'd memorized every one because she'd been the one to enforce them. I asked her what had happened, and she said that he'd broken the most important rule, the one about the basement. And I asked her what was in the basement, and she looked at me for a long time and said, that was the wrong question, and I asked what the right question was, and she said the right question was why she brought me here, knowing what she knew, knowing what the rules were for, and when I demanded an answer, she just stood up and walked to the basement door and put her hand on the padlock and said that she'd brought me here because she needed to know if she could be different this time, if things could be different, if following the rules would be enough to keep everyone safe. And I asked her safe from what? And she unlocked the padlock and pulled the door open an inch and said that was the question she'd been trying to answer for 3 years. And I could see darkness beyond that inch of open door. Darkness that smelled like damp earth and something else. Something chemical and wrong. And I didn't move from that kitchen table because I was terrified of what would happen if I did. I didn't move. I sat at that kitchen table and watched her hand on the padlock. And I felt the weight of every question I'd been too afraid to ask pressing down on me at once. And I realized that the locked basement wasn't about structural damage or old wiring or anything sensible. It was about her, about what had happened before, about whatever she was protecting me from with those rules and that careful silence and that strange certainty that had been following me since we'd pulled into the driveway. And I prayed silently that God would give me the strength to hear whatever came next, because I could tell it wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't going to be something I could just brush off and move past. She saw the fear on my face, and she closed the door and locked it again and sat back down across from me. And she told me the rest of it, not all at once, but in pieces. The way you describe a dream that doesn't quite make sense even as you're telling it. And I learned that she'd come here with a man named David that they'd been together for almost a year, that he'd been charming and attentive and everything she'd wanted until the night he wasn't, until the night he came back from the basement with something in his hands and a look in his eyes that she said she'd never forget. And I asked her what he'd found down there, and she said that was the thing. He hadn't found anything. He'd brought something with him, something he'd hidden in the basement before they'd arrived, something he'd needed the lock to keep safe until he was ready to use it. And when I asked, use it for what? She just shook her head and said the rules were there to make sure it never came out, and that every time she came back to this cabin, she had to check that the lock was still intact, that nothing had changed, that the rules had done what they were supposed to do. We checked out at 10 a.m. exactly, like the rules required, and Jenna walked through the cabin one last time with a thoroughness that made sense now, checking locks, checking windows, checking the basement door twice. She didn't say anything on the drive down the mountain, and neither did I, because what was there to say? And when we finally drove away, I looked in the rearview mirror and saw the cabin getting smaller and smaller until it disappeared behind the trees. And I felt something loosen in my chest that I hadn't realized was tight. And I told myself it was over, that we'd gotten through it, that maybe now we could move forward with something honest between us. But 2 days later, back home, I was going through our photos from the trip, and I noticed one I'd taken on the second morning, a picture of Jenna standing on the deck with the valley behind her. And I zoomed in on her reflection in the glass door, and I saw what she was looking at. Not the view, not me, but something behind me, something that shouldn't have been visible from that angle. And in the reflection of the window, I could see the basement door at the end of the hallway, and the padlock was open, hanging loose on the hasp, like someone had been checking it just moments before I'd taken the picture. And my heart nearly stopped when I realized what that meant, because Jenna had been standing on the deck with me when I'd taken this photo. She couldn't have been the one to open it, which meant someone else was in that cabin, which meant the rules weren't just about what was inside the basement anymore. When I texted Jenna to ask about it, she called me within seconds, and her voice was calm and steady and familiar and completely wrong. And she said that was impossible. The lock had been closed the whole time, and I asked her how she knew, because she'd been standing on the deck with me when I'd taken the photo. And there was a long silence on the other end of the line. And then she said quietly that some rules weren't about keeping things in or out. They were about making sure you never had to see what's already there. And I hung up, and I've been staying at this hotel ever since, because I can't go back to the apartment. I can't look at her across the breakfast table. I can't stop thinking about that padlock hanging open in a reflection of a cabin that was supposed to be empty. And I keep wondering what she meant when she said some rules were about making sure you never had to see what's already there. Because I think she meant me. I think she meant that the rules were written to protect me from seeing what's already inside her. And I think she's been waiting 3 years for someone to break them.